Military families in Kentucky prepare to welcome home loved ones from overseas.
The plan was to have a reception for them, and then those soldiers would be reunited with their families and friends.
At the same time, at a small Canadian airport,
there's wreckage all over the place. There was massive destruction.
Well, nobody could have survived this.
256 people are dead. It's one of the worst aviation accidents of all time.
Anytime a crash of this sort would occur, immediate suspicions would be raised.
Answers will be hard to come by.
It does not advance safety to get the wrong cause of an accident.
As two radically different scenarios for the crash emerge.
Mayday, Mayday.
Arrow Air Flight 1285 is nearing the end of a 10,000-kilometer journey from Egypt to the United States. The DC-8 is on its way to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, via Germany and Newfoundland. On board are 8 crew members and 248 passengers. Most of them are US soldiers with the famed 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles.
That division fought through World War II, through D-Day and the Battle of Normandy, dropped in behind the German lines, has really marked its place in history. I think everybody who serves in that division has a special loyalty and a special feeling about the division and being part of it. They had been in the Sinai for 5.5 months. So I'm sure they were anxious to get back to friends and family and to enjoy the holidays.
To bring the soldiers home, the military has hired the charter carrier Arrow Air.
It was not unusual to do that back in the 70s and 80s, where the government would contract with the civilian airlines to transport troops in and out of the country.
At 5:30 in the morning, the Douglas DC-8 lands at Gander International Airport, on the eastern edge of Newfoundland, Canada.
They had to refuel in Gander before they could complete the flight into Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
Okay, guys, I'd like to be refueled, checked, and wheels up in 90 minutes. Roger that.
Captain John Griffin has been an Arrow Air pilot for 4 years. He's also a flight instructor for the airline. First Officer John Connolly will be at the controls when Flight 1285 leaves Gander. Mike Fowler, the flight engineer, monitors the aircraft's mechanical systems.
Okay, you want to give her the once-over?
While the pilots run through a series of pre-flight checklists, the flight engineer steps out to inspect the plane's exterior. He'll look for any damage to the fuselage or engines and check for buildups of ice on the plane. The soldiers wait inside the airport. Some shop for souvenirs at the gift shop.
Anything? Okay. Roger that.
All right, 15,538 gallons, 101,000 pounds. Passengers and cargo unchanged.
Weight's confirmed? Okay. We're good to go. That puts us here. Rotation is 144 knots.
Yeah, that looks good.
On the airspeed indicator is a marker, or bug. It reminds the crew of the exact speed they must hit in order to get the plane off the ground.
bugs are set on the right. Copy that.
With the refueling and pre-flight checks complete, the 248 soldiers get back on board.
I think it was probably a very joyous mood because when they landed in Gander, I know some of them went in and used the telephones to call Fort Campbell and call their families and say they were in Gander and they'd be home in a few hours.
Gander Tower.
Mayday 950, we've completed refueling and pre-flight checks. Requesting taxi to runway 31.
Big A 950, winds at 290 at 4 knots. Takeoff now, runway 22.
A last-minute change puts Arrow Air on a different runway than originally planned.
9,900 feet, take off to the south, we're good. Copy that, Gander, runway 22.
Big A 950, you are cleared for takeoff.
Merry Christmas.
Roger that, Gander Tower. And a Merry Christmas to you, too.
The DC-8 accelerates to takeoff speed.
80 knots. Check.
B1.
Rotate.
Arrow Air 1285 lifts off from Gander Airport at 6:46 a.m. But just seconds later...
She's flying like a pig. Positive rate. Negative.
I'm sure for the last few seconds, those soldiers knew that there was a serious problem in hand.
What's your altitude? Pull up. Come on, airspeed. Airspeed. Watch the trees.
Yes, Aero 1285 is down, just off runway 22. Estimate 2,000 to 4,000 feet.
At the small airport in Gander, Newfoundland, emergency crews race to the crash site. It's a field of wreckage, bodies, and personal effects. Thousands of liters of jet fuel are feeding a massive blaze.
It didn't look like aircraft, it was just probably a 30-foot high burning mass of metal and fuel and everything.
Hey, any survivors?
Canadian Air Force Captain Tom Badcock is one of the first on the scene.
So as an Air Force officer, of course, I had been to numerous crashes, but this was nothing like I had ever seen in my life before. And to see the devastation and to see my basically comrades lying on the ground in pieces was, words can't describe it. Many of them had bought t-shirts saying, "I survived Gander, Newfoundland." And we found that particularly emotional.
After hours of frantic searching through the charred wreckage, everyone's worst fears are realized. The crash has claimed the lives of all 256 people on board. The search for the cause of the disaster is already underway, but it will lead to controversy and ultimately to the demise of the Canadian Aviation Safety Board. For the US military, the crash of Flight 1285 in Gander, Newfoundland is a historic loss.
If you take a look at the history of the 101st Airborne Division Air Assault, even in World War II, that division never lost so many people in such a short period of time as they did on December the 12th in 1985 in Gander.
The Canadian military sets up a security perimeter around the crash site.
We controlled all access to and from the site. The RCMP asked me if I would identify an object which they thought to be strange.
Never seen a casing like this before.
And he said, does this have any kind of a chemical or a nuclear connotation? And I said, no, I have no idea what it is.
The find raises suspicion about what was on the flight.
Certainly it's possible that Aero Air could have been carrying things either that it shouldn't have been carrying or that weren't on any kind of cargo manifest.
David McNair is an investigator with the Canadian Aviation Safety Board.
There are aircraft parts everywhere, and you immediately became aware that it was going to be hard to find things that you needed to find.
McNair is joined by colleague Peter Bogue. They arrive hours after the crash to a scene of complete devastation.
The sights and smells, it's always unpleasant, but you just have to. You have to do this, part of your job.
The terrible scale of the crash quickly makes headlines around the world.
It will have a tremendous impact on this division.
This is not only a sad day for the 101st Airborne, but a sad day for the nation.
Most of the young men and women we mourn were returning to spend the holidays with their families. You do not grieve alone. We grieve as a nation, together. As together we say goodbye to those who died in the service of their country.
There is just no way that I can express to you how tragic that was, with the loss of so many people in that one plane crash.
The Americans were really suffering in terms of military losses just 2 years prior to the crash of the Aero Air flight. The United States had lost a large number of soldiers in a suicide truck bombing in Beirut. So the losses, in a sense, were mounting, and although the numbers these days might not strike us as extraordinary, they certainly were extraordinary at the time. It wasn't just some assortment of soldiers, a large number of them from one of the leading American military units in the American Army. You know, all of this raised, if you like, the symbolic stakes, quite apart from the casualty toll of the loss of life that occurred.
Investigators immediately interview the Gander ground crew and get some intriguing information.
Morning. Did you see the flight engineer inspect the aircraft? But they did not de-ice the wings before taking off.
Yeah, we picked up a little bit of ice coming in. We're good to go.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we were concerned about icing because the refueler witness indicated that they had picked up some ice on the approach.
Coming in from the north.
They turn to meteorological reports for the early hours of December the 12th.
In early morning, it was very, very icy. And it had been severe freezing rain.
They flew in during the time that the forecast was for icing.
McNair and Bogue wonder if the crew of Flight 1285 may have made a serious error by not de-icing. They check to see what other planes flying out of Gander did that morning.
There were 2 other takeoffs this morning. One de-iced, one didn't.
And we noted there was one Boeing 737 that departed that picked up quite a bit of ice on its departure, and that was an indicator to us that the probability of icing accretion or ice gathering on the aircraft was quite high.
But the other aircraft, a British Aerospace VC-10, had been on the ground for 50 minutes and did not de-ice. It got off the ground safely.
And they took off within 2 hours of each other.
Ice cannot have been the only factor in this crash.
Big 8950, winds 290 at 4 knots. Take off now, runway 22.
In search of other factors, they consider the last-minute runway change.
Copy that, Gander, runway 22.
Not the runway they were expecting.
But they quickly conclude that the alternate runway could not have had any bearing on this crash.
Runway 22 is the longest runway at Gander, so in fact it gave them the best margin for performance.
Investigators examine and document the crash site, trying to determine the trajectory of the plane as it went down.
This was a very heavily wooded area, and as it got closer to the ground, it started clipping the trees.
And we're going to need pictures of the treetops as well, and we're going to need aerial shots.
But what they need most of all is the information from the plane's 2 black boxes. They could hold the key to understanding what doomed Flight 1285. But as soon as they're recovered, McNair sees a potential problem.
We were disappointed to see with such an old recorder, an old foil recorder, as they really just don't give enough information to the investigators.
Well, send them off to Ottawa and we'll see what we've got.
The older design of FDR engraves data on a slow-moving roll of stainless steel foil. Though the foil is fire-resistant, it can record only 4 flight parameters, such as airspeed and altitude. The newer digital flight recorders can record hundreds of parameters. All they can do is send the black boxes to the National Research Council's Flight Recorder Playback Center and hope for the best. Then, with the investigation only hours old, it takes a drastic turn. An overseas US consulate receives word from someone claiming responsibility for the crash. The caller says it was the work of Islamic Jihad, a branch of Hezbollah.
If you had to think about any one terrorist group operating in the Middle East at this time, which had an intent as well as a capacity to target American military personnel, that was Hezbollah.
The call opens the possibility that a terrorist bomb brought down Flight 1285.
Tensions were really high in the world at that time. When an aircraft fully loaded with American soldiers crashes, there's always questions that come up.
McNair sends portions of the wreckage to a Royal Canadian Mounted Police forensics lab to be tested for bomb residue. The team searches for evidence that Flight 1285 exploded before it hit the ground. They look for any fallen debris between the runway and the point of impact.
If the aircraft had exploded before it hit the trees, one would expect something would come off the aircraft and we would have found it. We didn't find anything, nothing at all. So we knew with confidence that the aircraft hit the trees, the first impact, intact.
It's a similar story when the test results from the RCMP come back. They find no trace of bomb residue. And both US and Canadian officials suggest Islamic Jihad's claim of responsibility could be false.
One of the things that obviously benefits terrorist organizations is to spread the claim for operational responsibility very, very broadly, so to kind of boost the reputation of their organization, again, to instill greater fear. So it's difficult to separate fact from fiction.
With terrorism looking less likely, investigators continue to focus on the performance of the aircraft.
35 feet, 6 inches. 4.5-degree declination.
The airplane had struck some trees about half a mile from the runway. And we could see a distinct pattern in the trees.
Using photographs from the crash site, investigators plot the height of 378 trees to determine the DC-8's exact position as it went down.
The airplane was right wing low with a nose high attitude relative to the trees. through photogrammetry, we determined that in fact the aircraft was way above the stall angle of the aircraft. So the aircraft was clearly stalled in a high rate of descent.
The plane's radical nose-up position prevented it from getting the lift needed to keep it in the air. Investigators can't explain why the plane was flying at such an extreme angle. One clue about what the pilots were doing comes from a piece of cockpit wreckage, the airspeed indicator.
Look here. There's the bug at 140.
It shows that the crew set a takeoff speed of 144 knots.
I would say 165.
And that the plane reached an airspeed of at least 165 knots.
Bugs set on the right. Copy that.
Investigators hope that a much more detailed picture of the pilot's last moments will emerge from the cockpit voice recorder. But they're in for a disappointment.
Well, it doesn't sound like it recorded anything from the cockpit.
The cockpit recorder wasn't functioning properly. It didn't record any of the crew's conversations.
With the absence of cockpit voice recorder, we don't know exactly what the crew was doing or what they were facing.
Their hopes now rest with a flight data recorder.
Even this rudimentary recorder would have got some indication to show what speeds they rotated at. What warning lights, if any, were they seeing? What was the reaction? All these things are extremely valuable.
But it turns out to be only marginally more useful than the cockpit voice recorder.
The recorder for the Arrow Air accident was extremely limited. We were able to determine, first of all, speed, a little bit of altitude, and heading of the aircraft. And there was no indication on there of engine power, bank angle, pitch angle.
The flight data recorder tells investigators that Arrow Air 1285 began its takeoff roll and increased to a speed of 167 knots. Liftoff occurred 51 seconds from the start of the roll. 2 seconds later, the speed began to decrease.
Come on, airspeed! Airspeed!
Speed dropped off very quickly, and so we knew that the aircraft was below normal flying speed. We got that much from the recorder.
It tells us almost nothing.
But a closer look at the flight data does reveal a potentially valuable clue. The distance needed to get to takeoff speed was longer than the pilots had planned for.
We looked at the acceleration distances, and it took a little bit longer than expected.
4,300 feet, 100 knots. 6,300 feet, 144 knots.
They should be lifting off now.
Investigators discover that liftoff occurred some 4 seconds later, or more than 1,000 feet further than it should have.
8,000 feet, 167 knots.
Extra 1,000 feet to get off the ground.
Why did it take them so long?
B1.
Rotate.
They used the full power, and we would expect them to rotate a little earlier, take off a little earlier.
The longer than normal takeoff supports the original theory that ice on the wings played a role in the crash. But investigators know that can't be the whole story.
Icing itself is not necessarily the only thing that happened. Accidents don't just usually have one item, they have several items.
Determined to find out what else besides ice on the wings contributed to the crash, the CASB turns its attention to the plane's flaps. For the DC-8, the optimal flap setting for takeoff is 18 degrees.
Looks like the flaps were extended.
With detailed work, we could say with some reasonable certainty of where the flaps were, which we believe were in the normal takeoff position.
They wonder if ice, combined with malfunctioning engines, caused the plane to stall. The engines are sent to the CASB in Ottawa for a full inspection.
Each engine was recovered on site, and immediately you can tell that there was rotational damage on all the engines.
Wood debris is found deep inside all 4 of the turbines.
A lot of tree debris. It means the engine was running when it hit the trees.
Evidence shows the DC-8 was properly configured for takeoff and that there was nothing wrong with the engines. So why was Flight 1285 slow to get off the ground? Investigators focus in on the weight of the aircraft.
It's 101,000 pounds for fuel, passengers, and cargo unchanged.
They had predicted that each passenger and baggage would weigh 170 pounds.
That average weight, 170 pounds, matches the estimated weight for male passengers set out in the Arrow Air guidelines.
As a pilot, having flown many military people around, this didn't seem to ring true, so we immediately looked at that aspect of the investigation.
Good morning. Have a rec form for some personnel files.
Following his hunch, McNair soon makes a crucial discovery.
Regular commercial flights has a mixture of folks. It has men, women, children, so then the average doesn't work out as much.
But this was no ordinary commercial flight. All 256 passengers were adults, almost all of them large men.
We actually looked at the medical records of the passengers in terms of getting their actual weight during their last medical.
In my own case, I normally weigh 175, but when I've got all my gear on, or I'm bringing it on board an aircraft, I'm bringing on board 200 pounds or more.
We estimated that the more realistic weight would have been 220 pounds per passenger. That includes the passenger, everything they were carrying, and the equipment they had.
With the new estimates, he calculates the weight of the passengers at more than 54,000 pounds. That's 12,000 pounds heavier than the weight recorded on the load sheet.
It's not even close.
But this plane had been flying with that weight all night, taking off from Cairo, then from Cologne without any problems. The ice picked up in Gander may have made the difference.
You can take off at a heavier than normal weight, and if there are no other factors at play, you can get away with it. If you have something else like ice, you have a serious problem.
Investigators now strongly suspect that it was a combination of ice and extra weight that prevented the DC-8 from staying in the air.
Okay, this has to be it. Ice and weight.
We had a lot of scientific basis to say that the aircraft should have flown but did not. Why didn't it fly? We had 2 powerful reasons. One was weight, the other was even probably more powerful, is a small amount of ice contamination on the aircraft.
But they can only theorize. No one in Gander saw ice on the wings. It's impossible to know how much there was. That's one problem. McNair and Bogue must now confront another. Some of their own colleagues on the CASB are raising doubts about the findings. One of those with questions is board member and aviation expert, Les Philotas.
Well, as soon as I started looking at the draft report, I skimmed some of it and went to the part that was my technical specialty, the flight data recorder part, and as soon as I looked at it, I said there's something really wrong here.
Philotas immediately wonders how the aircraft could lose thrust and crash so quickly after takeoff.
I did rough calculations, and it just showed that to get that kind of deceleration, you'd have to lose not 1, 2, or 3 engines, but all 4, and that was just a startling thing to see right away.
What's your altitude? Pull up. Come on, airspeed. Airspeed!
They said the aircraft would, I believe that the exact phrase was, destroyed by a fuel-fed fire. The early reports, everybody who was around there mentioned the massive explosion and the mushroom cloud.
See this thing coming come across the front of the truck, and it was like a flame on the bottom, eh?
Two truckers on the highway were almost under the flight path when the aircraft passed over, and they both said they saw fire on the right-hand side.
US Army officials deny there was any unreported or classified cargo on board Arrow Air 1285. But Philotas has reason to doubt that claim.
When the troops' equipment was loaded on board, there were some of these big boxes. What could have been on there, and we couldn't get any answer. There was no cargo manifest, and it was another contentious question that was never settled.
Not much attention clearly was paid to security procedures, and you know, this was a different time, admittedly, but still I think the lack of security at Cairo at the airport as the soldiers came on board the Arrow Air flight for the return journey, I think anybody would have to regard it as shocking, even for their time, and it's the kind of thing that would never be allowed to happen today.
Philotas joins those speculating that Arrow Air Flight 1285 was the victim of a terrorist plot.
Was it Hezbollah? Did it have any kind of European connections? And the big question, but always in the back of American governmental and security authorities' minds, is there a Cold War dimension to this? Are the Soviets involved?
The testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, I do. Please be seated.
Some now wonder if Arrow Air 1285 was at the center of the biggest global scandal of the time. The US plot to illicitly provide Iran with arms in exchange for American hostages.
Arrow Air was indeed one of the airlines that assisted a covert operation that was being mounted at the time out of the Reagan White House by a famous individual by the name of Colonel Ollie North. And the Iran-Contra business was very tangled in a very peculiar covert operation.
It was not a thin, tiny layer of ice on the wings.
Philotas points to photographic evidence to prove his case.
My colleague made a trip out to Gander and went to the RCMP photo lab there, where they had literally thousands that they took on the crash site. Many photos that seemed to indicate that there was some kind of an explosion on board. That's just like if you took a piece of aluminum foil and poked your finger in it. It would curl out from the inside to the outside, and it would be obvious from which side you put your finger through.
Philotas becomes even more suspicious when he learns that an independent investigator hired by Arrow Air had explored the possibility of an onboard explosion.
He carefully looked at everything and found that on the number 3 engine, that's the inboard engine on the right-hand side, some of the inlet guide vanes, 3 of them consecutive ones, had sort of a dent in the leading edge, and one of them had some red paint on it.
That investigator concluded that there could have been a mid-air explosion, and that the damage and the paint markings inside the engine could have been caused by debris exploding outward from the main fuselage. Another key piece of information for Philotas comes from the post-mortem examination of some of the 256 victims. Autopsies indicate that there were extremely high levels of carbon monoxide in their blood.
So if they have combustion products in their lungs, natural inference is that they must have breathed in some combustion products before the crash.
From all this evidence, Philotas and his colleagues paint their own picture of the crash.
Hell was that? Smoke! Smoke in the cockpit! Smoke!
But the lead investigators, McNair and Bogue, maintain that the sabotage theories are nothing more than a sensationalist distraction.
We had no indication that terrorism was a player, but we did have a lot of indication that there was an aircraft performance problem and there were icing problems.
McNair and Bogue decide the only way to end all the speculation is to scientifically prove their theory that ice combined with extra weight is what brought down Flight 1285.
Okay, you want to give her the once-over?
Before the mid-1980s, little was known about the aerodynamic impact of very thin ice accumulation. The flight engineer who inspected the aircraft was likely only looking for large buildups of ice that would make the plane significantly heavier, not thin coatings on top of the wings.
As part of the investigation, we did a lot of research on the effects of ice on aircraft.
Aerodynamic tests carried out in a wind tunnel reveal that even a small amount of ice contamination can significantly reduce wing lift.
Just a small amount, say the size of some sandpaper, if that's the type of surface you have, it can seriously degrade a large aircraft. That was a surprise to me.
The team carries out further tests in a flight simulator.
We basically had to reprogram the simulator to degrade the performance to simulate ice.
V1, rotate.
Every attempt to fly the simulator with the exact same parameters as Flight 1285 ends the same way, with a stall and a crash.
Okay, let's run it again with 10,000 less pounds.
From the simulator trials, we realized with icing on board, what degraded the lift characteristics of the aircraft, it was difficult to fly a normal profile, and you could easily lose control of the aircraft.
Just flying like a pig. Positive rate? Negative? Full power.
The pilots would have been able to see that their plane wasn't climbing fast enough.
What's your altitude? Pull up.
Come on, airspeed. Airspeed!
Watch the trees.
First Officer Connolly pulled the nose back, trying to get the plane in the air. What he didn't realize is that he was sealing their fate. The DC-8 was already on the verge of a stall. Pulling the nose up only made things worse. The aircraft's weight had been underestimated, its lift compromised by ice on the wings. A fatal combination.
If you take one of the factors out, if you take the ice out and have the same weight, maybe you won't have the accident. If you take out the heavy weight and still have the icing, maybe you won't have the accident. But if you have them combined together, you have the accident.
As for the suspicious paint markings found inside the engine, McNair determines they came from a front-end loader used to clear debris at the crash site. As well, the extreme intensity of the fire could have caused the abnormally high level of carbon monoxide in the victim's blood. Even the truckers' accounts of pre-impact flames can be explained.
If you have an airplane flying at high angle of attack, where it's in the stalled regime, typically or often you will have flame coming from the engine because of compressor stall.
As for the terrorists' capability to pull off such a complex, brazen attack, there is significant doubt.
Could they have done it? In terms of intent, yes. In terms of actually pulling that operation off in the circumstances, you know, that seems to me low probability, but just at the edges of the margins of the possible.
There was a lot of controversy, which we just basically had to deal with in terms of keeping on with our job, because the investigation is not an emotional issue, it's a scientific issue. So we basically had to stick with science. We didn't see any evidence of any other kind of explosion. We only saw the evidence of an explosion caused by impact and the aircraft breaking up.
McNair believes his conclusion carries an urgent warning for the entire airline industry.
A lot of people have a hard time believing that a little tiny bit of ice on a large wing will have a big effect, but it does.
After nearly 3 years of painstaking research and investigation, the Canadian Aviation Safety Board is ready to release its report. But what is supposed to provide answers and prevent similar accidents instead ignites a storm of controversy.
The ice theory is flat out wrong.
CASB investigators believe they have a convincing report that explains the complex cause of the crash of Flight 1285.
I was hoping that, as all investigators do, when the final report came out, that in fact the safety message would be out there and would be accepted.
But 4 of the 9 members of the board disagree with the report's conclusion.
This investigation appears to involve a cover-up.
It's impossible that ice would have been a factor.
Crash investigators are, they're always under pressure to come up with an answer sooner than they would like. And sometimes, depending on the intensity of that pressure, can perhaps create crash investigations which are less than satisfactory.
The dissenters take the unprecedented step of releasing their own minority report, citing an onboard explosion as the cause.
We had an extremely difficult time in putting out our dissenting report. We were given a very restricted time, and then there was an attempt to suppress it. I was asked the question outright, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to try to save your job, or do you want to get the truth about this accident? My answer was, well, I want to save my job by getting at the truth.
It was quite unusual to have a dissenting report written with photographs. I don't see merit in it. I totally don't understand why it was issued in the first place. Why would you come up with this? What's the scientific basis for it? There is no science.
Okay, look. Paint transfer means nothing. The crew blood samples means nothing. The pedaling is meaningless. Therefore, you have no evidence of terrorism. This proves nothing.
In this particular case, of course, what we had was an extraordinary outcome, where you have a majority and a minority report which are deeply divergent and which raise very different kinds of pictures about what the outcome of this crash would be.
I think it's very tough for families and friends not to have final closure on something. There was really no definitive answer to what caused that crash. If I was a family member, I'd have questions too.
But on March the 10th, 1989, while the controversy continues to swirl, there's tragic evidence that McNair and Bogue's message has not been heard. In Dryden, Ontario, in wintry conditions, the crew of a Fokker F-28 elects not to de-ice. Just seconds after takeoff, the plane cannot achieve sufficient lift to stay airborne. The accident was almost identical to Arrow Air 1285.
The airplane hit the tree canopy intact. After that, it exploded because, in fact, it hit the ground with a lot of fuel on board.
The crash kills 24 of the 69 people on board.
It was pretty clear from Dryden that icing or snow may have been a factor in this as well.
If only the investigators' warning had been heard, the tragedy in Dryden may never have happened.
The fact that there was a lot of controversy around this investigation was very unfortunate because basically it took away from the safety message. Aircraft, like the DC-8, are very vulnerable to icing contamination. That message was lost because of the controversy in the bomb theory.
But those who held firm to the bomb theory stand by their actions.
It does not advance safety to get the wrong cause of an accident. The real safety message is that you have to get at the truth, and the truth and the facts of this accident were never finally established.
The controversy over this investigation spelled the end of the Canadian Aviation Safety Board. It was scrapped and later replaced with a new, better regulated agency.
We learned a lesson that cost a lot of people their lives, and that lesson didn't get passed on to other people, and other people lost their lives. That's the sad part for me.
I know in my own case, if I really didn't know all the answers and I had lost someone in that terrible crash, I wouldn't be satisfied. It's tough when you don't know and you've lost someone that's near and dear to you. I think we all want to know.